carbon dioxide. Also the use of that captured carbon to make useful products, the removal of CO2 actually from the atmosphere, not just from industrial facilities and power plants, and finally the safe and permanent geologic storage of that CO2. Craig reached out to me earlier today and asked if I'd be talking about agriculture. I have colleagues that are working a lot on soil carbon and nitrogen management. It's clearly really important. I actually personally, with grazing on my ranch, try to enhance soil sequestration, but it is kind of outside the realm of carbon capture in that sense, so it's not part of this presentation. I need to, 1 second here. Just say very briefly about the Great Plains Institute, where I work and have worked for many years. We're focused on the energy economy, the energy system, and promoting all aspects of making, producing low carbon energy. And we work in a variety of areas, from energy efficiency and productivity to decarbonizing electricity production. On the transportation fuel side, beneficial electrification wherever possible, and where not, having zero and low carbon fuels. And then finally, for all the rest, capturing the carbon and either putting it to beneficial use where you reduce the emissions, or storing it permanently in the subsurface. And the latter, of course, is the biggest component of that, is the geologic storage. I run our carbon management program. I won't read these things to you. I'll share this slide deck with Craig afterwards as a PDF so you can all have it. But we are focused on managing carbon from all sources in the economy, and it both has a climate purpose but also an economic purpose. The most carbon intensive sectors in our economy also happen to have some of the highest paying blue collar jobs remaining in our economy. So this is a really important strategy also for sustaining high wage jobs. We actually take our cue in our work from the success that we've had with renewable energy, both in terms of actual deployment on the ground, but also how incentives and other policies have scaled up wind and solar in the marketplace. And we are focused on economy-wide deployment of carbon capture, all sectors, which is necessary to meet the 2 and the 1.5 degree climate goals, which I'll talk about in a moment. I won't walk through all these different milestones, but we've been working on carbon capture since 2002. We were inspired by Dakota gasification as an example of what can be done in traditional energy production to manage carbon, and the work has been evolving ever since, and I'll be talking about that over the course of this presentation. So in any presentation, I usually start off to try to address what are some common misconceptions about carbon capture. The first is you will often hear that the technology is unproven or it doesn't work. That's just categorically not true. The experience with large-scale, successful carbon capture goes back to 1972 in West Texas. Now, this was not done for climate reasons at all. It was done to capture CO2 from industrial processes and use that CO2 in oil production. But what it did do, the impetus of needing that CO2 to produce additional oil, led companies to deploy carbon capture over time in different industrial sectors and built up a very significant operational and commercial experience. And what you see on the left on this slide are some of the important milestones, mostly in North America. There's one example from the Middle East. But what you see is started with gas processing in the 1970s, moved to fertilizer production via gasification in the 1980s, and the early 2000s here in North Dakota. And then in the previous decade, we started capturing CO2 off of ethanol production, off of fermentation. And then carbon capture was commercially demonstrated at a refinery, capturing CO2 off of hydrogen production. Then what we see in this current decade, I guess, well, it's now 2020, so the previous decade. In 2014, the first commercial scale retrofit of a power plant happened just across the border at Boundary Dam near Estevan. And then following on that, in 2017, NRG retrofitted their Parish power plant near Houston. That's the Petronova project. And around this time frame as well, Shell deployed carbon capture off of a bitumen upgrading process, and then a really important project came online in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi, large-scale capture of CO2 at a steel plant, which is a plant I've actually visited, took a group there to visit. And then the most recent large-scale project is also ethanol, but important because a 1 million-ton scale in Decatur, Illinois, and also storing that CO2 in a saline formation as opposed to in an oil and gas field. And then on the right there, you see what's actually kind of a poor map of the existing CO2 pipeline infrastructure, but it's about 5,200 miles right now of CO2 pipeline. And there are 13 large-scale commercial facilities, and they capture about 25 million metric tons a year. It's close to 40 million tons globally right now from carbon capture. So the point here is not that this is enough from a climate standpoint or even close to enough. It's not. But we have done enough and know enough and how well it works to know that the problem going forward, the challenge is not technological, it's policy. It's a policy challenge going forward for deployment. The other point that we make is that if you take the climate math seriously, namely the Paris goal of holding warming to 2 degrees centigrade, or the more aspirational goal of holding it to 1.5 degrees, carbon capture is not optional. The IEA modeling of the 2-degree goal has 14% of cumulative reductions from 2015 to 2050 coming from carbon capture. By 2050, ramping up to a full 20% of the total annual reduction. So a fifth of the solution set coming from carbon capture. What's important is that, contrary to the public discussion of carbon capture, it's not just about power plants. 45% of those total annual reductions in 2050 are modeled to come from industrial sources of CO2. The IPCC fifth assessment on the 2-degree goal also found that if in the modeling you intentionally exclude carbon capture as a solution that the models can choose, costs go up nearly 140%. Now, if you think about the politics of meeting mid-century climate goals, if we are increasing the cost over 100% by excluding an option, then we are putting at risk meeting that goal. The final thing I'll say on the climate aspect of this, not the final thing, but on this slide, is about I want to say would have been was fall of 2018, if I recall, is when the IPCC 1.5 degree report and modeling came out, and they chose 4 scenarios to how we could meet the 1.5 degree goal, all of them getting us to zero around mid-century, and then to varying degrees going negative because we overreach, and the only way we can ultimately meet the 1.5 degree goal is to overshoot and then go negative with emissions globally to get ourselves back to where we need to be. In 3 of those 4 scenarios, carbon capture and atmospheric carbon removal are fundamental to meeting the 1.5 degree goal. My view, and in the view of I think most scientists and practitioners, the modeling run where it didn't require carbon capture and carbon removal, the assumptions that it took for the modeling to solve basically required assumptions that have never been met in human history. And so it's kind of a scary prospect to put at risk a climate goal to rely on options that we've never met before in terms of scale and scope. So I want to take a little time on the climate slide because obviously that's, for the group we have here today, that's why we're assembled. And then here's one more slide to just take the IEA modeling in their sustainable development scenario for the 2-degree goal and just put carbon capture in that broader context. As you can see in the graph there, carbon capture by 2040 is 7%, and I already mentioned 20% by 2050. So this start, like in the energy system, it's always the case with a technology that's not widely deployed. It starts off small, you get a critical mass, and then it scales. Right now we're in the process of scaling with wind and solar, but if you look at the global energy system, even with wind and solar, we're not that far in the deployment curve. We're even further behind with carbon capture, so we need a critical mass of projects in every major sector of the economy by 2030 so that we can actually scale to 2050 and meet the climate goals. And you see on the right there, this has at 20 megatons in 2017. We're actually a little higher than that. We're at 40 megatons annually, and we need to get to 2.28 gigatons. Annually. So we're talking about an enormous increase in deployment between now and 2040. What I would say is there are precedents for deployment at this pace and on this scale. One example, and I don't say this as in the sense that it's making any climate argument, but just the ability to scale a technology. Hydraulic fracturing of natural gas and now of oil as well is something that has transformed the energy economy in North America in a very short time period and scaled very quickly. So with the right policy framework and economic environment, what you're seeing here is possible. The other point I'll make, and I made this earlier, is that we're not just talking about power plants, we're talking about industrial sectors, and a third of global emissions in the U.S. and internationally come from industrial sectors. It's the most neglected part of the climate agenda. We've done a lot more in electric power and transportation, and we've grossly neglected industrial emissions. If you take the 1/3 of global emissions being industrial, a little over half of that is from just 3 sectors: steel, cement, and basic chemicals, in that order of magnitude. And what's really significant here is that over half of the emissions from those 3 sectors are unrelated to energy inputs. They are emissions that come from the chemistry of the industrial process itself. And so, you know, we can, even if we decarbonize, fully decarbonize, which is very difficult to do, high intensity energy inputs into industry, we still have over half the emissions that cannot be addressed through renewable energy or other types of electrification, things like that. And we have to have carbon capture. And so just these 3 sectors alone, if we don't address the process emissions unrelated to energy production, those 3 sectors alone would be enough to miss our climate targets. The really sobering thing here, and why this agenda is so urgent, is you take these 3 sectors and think about the scale. We're talking about, you know, nearly 15% of global emissions. And there is only one example of commercial scale carbon capture in those 3 industries globally, and that's the steel plant in Abu Dhabi. So this is a really, really enormous undertaking and deserves a much greater prioritization than it's received to date. The other thing is, I've kind of been leading up to this, that carbon capture is not a niche. It needs to be scaled, and it can be scaled. And here's just some things to think about. Just the U.S. oil and gas industry alone since 1972 has injected nearly 1.5 billion tons of CO2 into the subsurface. It's about 65 to 70 million tons a year. It results in about 3% of U.S. oil production, so it's a very small component. Enhanced oil recovery is a very small component of U.S. oil production, but given how much oil the United States produces, it's still a significant industry in its own right. What's important to note here is ultimately, to get to the mid-century climate goals, we need to be getting to 0. But in the time frame when we're transitioning from current use of oil and coal and other fossil energy resources to decarbonize fossil fuels and renewables and efficiency and so forth, we need to be reducing the carbon footprint of the fossil fuels that we do produce and use. And the good news here is that with using CO2 for enhanced oil recovery, you get a 37% net life cycle emissions reduction over producing the same barrel of oil without CO2. And that includes the oil that's produced in the process. So as we're shifting to a zero carbon economy, this is a way to decarbonize our current fossil energy use. Looking ahead, though, ultimately we need to be storing that CO2 in saline formations. And we already have one not long-standing. In the North Sea, Equinor, former Statoil, the Norwegian oil company, has been storing well over 1 million tons of CO2 in saline formations under the North Sea for over a quarter century. And it's worked very well. It's received all kinds of scientific assessment, and and they're doing it now as well in the Barents Sea way up north. ADM started doing it here in the past couple of years, out over 1 million tons a year in Illinois. An enormous amount of modeling went into that project, and the current modeling they're doing is showing that the CO2 in the saline formation is performing as it should, as it's expected to do. The key thing here is when you combine saline formations and oil and gas fields, we have at a minimum centuries worth of storage for CO2 emissions, potentially thousands of years. And the point I make to climate advocates like ourselves is if we can't figure out alternatives to our greenhouse gas emissions within centuries, then we've got bigger problems. The other thing other point that's often made is that carbon capture costs too much. And I'm going to address this briefly. But I can come back to this with more discussion, and I have another slide that we could look at as well to make this point. But carbon capture is the only climate technology that is expected to justify itself on the cost per ton basis. When we build a wind farm like the one that just came online next to my ranch, nobody asks what this wind farm here in Dickey County costs to reduce a ton of CO2 emissions. Everybody talks about the cost of electricity. So carbon capture is held to a different and higher standard than other zero and low carbon technologies. When you actually look at the whole range of necessary things we need to do to meet mid-century climate goals, of which carbon capture is only one of them, carbon capture is actually very cost effective on a per ton basis. So what you see here are different industries where carbon capture has been deployed or will be deployed soon. And you see that the costs are on the right increase as the concentration of the CO2 goes down. So the more concentrated the CO2 is, the less it costs to capture and manage it. And so obviously things like ethanol production, natural gas processing, ammonia production for fertilizer, these are very, very pure streams of CO2. We're in the range of $15 to $20 a ton. When you go up to hydrogen production, cement, catalytic cracking at refineries, steel production, you're getting in the $16 to $50 range, and you see the cost jump. And then ultimately, coal-fired power generation is 13 to 15%, and natural gas power generation is 4%, and those costs rise correspondingly. What is not understood is that in that first level of industries, the most concentrated, we're talking about costs of carbon management per ton that are less than any form of renewables. And even when you get up to the industrial sources, the 16 to 50%, it's cheaper than solar and cheaper than wind in some circumstances. It's only when you get to power generation are you finding that it starts to get more expensive compared to other things we need to be doing. But even there, capturing CO2 from a power plant is still significantly cheaper than rooftop solar, and especially rooftop solar with storage. So my point here is not to say we should be doing this and not renewables. My point is we need to do all these things, and in a spectrum of cost, carbon capture is cost competitive. So I want to just stop here for a moment. I'm going to be talking about some of the things that are going on at the federal and state and regional level, and just see if there are any actual just questions, things that anybody didn't understand, and we can get to discussion after I finish. Just want to check. Okay. Just let me know if basically, I'm going to talk about at the federal level what's happening in Congress with federal policy, and then shift to the state and regional level. I staff an effort called the Carbon Capture Coalition that I'll talk about in a moment, as well as a state carbon capture work group that now includes 16 states. And with the recent passage of what's called the 45Q tax credit, we are trying to work with states in entire regions to develop carbon capture projects to take advantage of this federal tax credit. So the Carbon Capture Coalition was founded in 2011 after the collapse of the Waxman-Markey climate legislation in 2009. I reached out to colleagues of mine in the climate advocacy world, as well as the oil and gas industry, the coal industry, and all kinds of other industries, to talk about what we might do that folks could agree on that didn't require people to necessarily buy into cap and trade or climate science, but could we agree that it's better to capture CO2 from power plants and industrial facilities, and rather than have that CO2 get released to the atmosphere, put it in oil and gas fields, produce some oil, but store more CO2 in the process. And it was intentionally was very, very focused to deal with, if you all remember that time early in the last decade, climate advocacy, we were in very, very difficult straits. There was a financial crisis, the federal climate legislation did not pass, and there was no forward movement. So this was an effort to jumpstart some progress, admittedly in a very narrow area, but nonetheless to get started. And that was then called the National Enhanced Oil Recovery Initiative. It's now called the Carbon Capture Coalition. It's now grown to 75 companies, unions, and environmental clean energy NGOs. And the industries range from, like what you might expect, fossil energy companies, the biggest coal and oil companies, but also the major ethanol players, clean tech companies, industrial gas companies, power companies, just kind of across whoever might have CO2 to manage. Most of them are involved in the coalition, and then the unions are the unions that care a lot about energy and industrial production, and the environmental and conservation NGOs include the nation's largest conservation groups: Nature Conservancy, Audubon, National Wildlife Federation. Environmental Defense Fund is also involved, World Resources Institute, Clean Air Task Force, and then a number of smaller groups. So there's the list. I'm not going to read that list to you, but you can just get a sense of the diversity of the companies, unions, and NGOs. I think fair to say that on energy and climate, it's the most diverse coalition in the United States. So we worked for 7 long years to basically get the 45Q tax credit reformed and expanded. Some of you are probably aware that Heidi Heitkamp was ultimately our lead sponsor when the bill passed. We worked with her and senators from both political parties, from spanning the entire political spectrum, from Sheldon Whitehouse, who is the leading climate advocate in the United States Senate, all the way to John Barrasso. And we got 25 senators to co-sponsor the bill, and we got 50 House members. And it took a tax credit for capturing CO2 and storing it geologically, and was not working as it was intended to, and we reformed it and expanded it. And the basic key things we did is to increase the credit values to $35 per ton for CO2 stored through enhanced oil recovery, and $50 per ton for CO2 sold in saline formation. So if you think about the Red Trail ethanol plant project in North Dakota that's underway, they're intending to store their CO2 in a saline aquifer in western North Dakota, and they would get $50 a ton because there's no oil production involved. Now, if an oil company were to purchase the CO2, they still have to store the CO2, but there's revenue involved, so that's why they get 35 rather than 50. We also expanded the tax credit to include using CO2 as a feedstock to produce things like low carbon fuels, chemicals, advanced materials like carbon fiber, carbon nanotubes, also construction materials from captured carbon. We have a company called LanzaTech that has already commercialized a process where they capture carbon monoxide off of steel plants. They convert that carbon monoxide to ethanol, and they use organisms from deep sea vents to convert that basically eat carbon monoxide as food and emit ethanol as a waste. And then they have a proprietary process to turn that ethanol into jet fuel. And they flew a 747 jetliner from Florida to London Gatwick a couple of years ago with 25% of the jet fuel actually originally coming from carbon monoxide emissions from a steel plant in China. So there's some pretty extraordinary things going on with carbon utilization as well. And this tax credit will provide $35 a ton for companies that are taking waste carbon and turning it into a product that has value, but the tax credit is for the CO2 emissions that are reduced in the process. So that's the tax credit. So if you're obviously familiar with the wind production tax credit, the solar investment tax credit, this is that type of an incentive for carbon capture. I'm not going to get into all that we're working on public policy except to say that this bill passed in February of 2018, and ever since then we have been, again, taking a page from wind and solar, working on developing a broad-based federal agenda. So if you think about wind and solar, the tax credits are really important, but there's a whole portfolio of policies we've developed over the years to support the development and deployment of renewable energy technologies in the marketplace. 45Q until 2 years ago, or I'm sorry, carbon capture until 2 years ago had no public policy support whatsoever. Now there's a tax credit, but there aren't all the other things like portfolio standards and procurement, and there's so many ways in which we support renewable energy. So our goal is to have the same type of portfolio for carbon capture so it becomes a full tool in the climate toolkit. And you see here our strategies. In addition to incentives and other federal policies, we need to build out CO2 pipeline infrastructure. If we're going to transport CO2 at a scale necessary to meet climate goals, then we need all regions of the country to have access to CO2 pipeline infrastructure. We also need to make sure that federal policy is not just focused on power plants and a few sources of CO2 emissions, but the whole industrial economy broadly. And then finally, right now, especially as we're about to spend several $1 trillion dealing with the COVID-19 crisis, we need to make sure, and this doesn't just apply to carbon capture, obviously it applies more broadly, but we need to make sure that we're spending those resources in terms of jump-starting our economy in the context of this pandemic, so that we're making sure that the projects that are moving forward, whether it's carbon capture, wind or solar or otherwise, continue to move forward, and we're moving towards a low and zero carbon economy. So we're very focused at the moment on COVID-19 and these stimulus packages. So, and I'm almost done on the federal side here. We spent, after the 45Q tax credit passed, we worked with the 75 coalition members over 5 months and went through a very serious exercise. Okay, so if we want to meet what the IEA modeling says is necessary, which is that carbon capture contributes 1/5 of total emissions reductions by 2050, then what kind of policy portfolio do we need building on the 45Q tax credit? And when you get this slide deck, this federal policy blueprint, that's actually a link, and you can go online and take a look at the federal policy blueprint. But we got all of these companies, unions, and NGOs to actually agree on a full portfolio of policies for carbon capture. And that's a pretty extraordinary thing when you think about how much conflict there is over energy and climate policy in the country right now. To have a group that includes all these players come together and agree on a path forward is significant. So I'm just quickly here, and I'll go through the state and regional part. Obviously, we know this from wind. Some of you on the call today, we worked together in the previous, I keep saying previous decade, we're now 2020, but in that I forget when we got the renewable electricity objective passed in North Dakota, but a number of us worked together on all kinds of state policies. That was one of them, biomass policy, but especially with wind. The development of wind energy and the success of wind energy in the United States is very much a federal and a state phenomenon. And so we're trying now to develop as quickly as we can the state counterpart to the progress we're making at the federal level. The state carbon capture work group is something that we started in 2015. Governor Bullock in Montana has been a huge advocate of carbon capture technology. Unfortunately, he didn't in his presidential campaign focus on that. I was hoping he would. But he's been a real leader as a governor on this. Governor Meade, a Republican in Wyoming, equally so. He's now retired. We reached out to both of them, and they agreed to co-chair a state work group that is now the dark green states that you see there, 16 states. We just added Maryland here in the last month, so we now have a bona fide blue state among the red and purple states in this group. What's interesting is that with the exception of Maryland and maybe in Illinois, and maybe Colorado, what you're talking about is a chunk, and we're all familiar with it as red state climate advocates. We all know this. This is the part of the country that has not bought into a traditional climate agenda. And that's why this work is so important, because this is carbon capture is a policy and a technology agenda that speaks to the real economic needs of industrial states, plains agricultural and energy producing states in the western states in the way that their economies currently are today, rather than what some of our fellow climate advocates might wish they were. And that's one reason why we've been adding states to this, is that there's a lot of support for developing these technologies. And what we found in working with these states is they've become more and more ambitious about thinking about carbon reduction and not just the economic side of this. So the first thing we did with these states is we developed a number of policy reports and white papers with modeling, and I won't go through all these with you, but when you get the slide deck, these are links. So you can, the first one was a comprehensive set of state federal policy recommendations from states. The second one was a first ever white paper and recommendations on developing a national CO2 pipeline infrastructure. And then the fourth one, for example, is the opportunity we have with ethanol for early deployment of carbon capture. But real intensive effort to put states on the map in making policy recommendations. We then also worked with the governors that were involved to get them to form a governor's partnership on carbon capture. And until the last election, we were up to 6 governors, and we lost 3 in the 2018 election to retirement and to losses. And we've added Governor Gordon in Wyoming, and we're about to add a couple more. So we're trying to get a core set of governors that are committed to this policy agenda to work together and help us elevate it on the national stage. We also, with the 45Q tax credit passed, Governor Bullock and Governor Meade and their staff came to us and said, okay, these policy reports were great, but the only way we're really going to sell this politically is to have projects. People need to see the jobs, they need to see the emissions reductions, they need to see the energy and industrial benefits that come from this technology. So with the 45Q tax credit available for projects for the first time, we organized what we call Midwestern and Western deployment initiatives. And so it's a big definition of the Midwest because of where the CO2 pipelines might go. It includes the Gulf Coast states, and then it's mostly the Mountain West in the West. Oklahoma and Texas are colored differently because the way CO2 pipelines are likely to build out, they would be taking CO2 from both regions. But we're now working with both these regions on developing state policy and supporting projects. We started bringing states together in early 2018 for this. We actually started bringing convening state officials, environmental groups, unions, companies in October of 2018, and we just now have completed 2 years worth of modeling, and we're helping states set up policy teams state by state and develop policies that are tailored to the modeling that we've done. And I'm going to share with you a little bit about the modeling because it really, I think, will cast for you in a different light the potential for carbon capture. So first of all, we put together a national modeling team that includes federal labs, it includes state research institutions, private consulting firms, and just individual technical experts. And that team you see on the left. And then these various partners contributed the components to the model, which are those 5 rectangles. So where does the CO2 come from? What does that CO2 cost to capture? What is the demand from the oil industry to purchase CO2 for storage through enhanced oil recovery? And then what is the potential to store CO2 in saline formations? And finally, what does a pipeline network cost to link it all together? And we took all that information that was developed over months and we plugged it into a program developed by Los Alamos National Lab called SIM-CCS, CCS standing for Carbon Capture and Storage. And we took, and here you can see the data points. These are all the facilities that are eligible for the 45Q tax credit. And we put them, got them all organized, started evaluating these facilities by capture costs. In the study area, which is the shaded area, we were working with these states. It doesn't mean there, as you can see, there are lots of opportunities on the coast, but we didn't include those states for now. That's a future round of work. And then you see here the number of facilities by industry in the study region, 418 total, multiple different industries plus power generation. And then you see on the right how much CO2 can be captured, and on the right the range of capture costs by industry. And then here you see it graphically, and again, this is another way of thinking about that table I showed you of capture costs. We have some really early opportunities with ethanol, fertilizer, gas processing, and then it gets more expensive to some of these other industries. Here are the places that we can store the CO2, so I hope this tickles your fancy, Dexter, as a geologist. The shaded areas are the saline formations in North America, and then the triangles are the oil and gas basins that have been assessed for their EOR, enhanced oil recovery potential, and storage. So those are the saline reservoirs and the oil and gas fields that were plugged into the model. And here's where it gets really interesting. This is our base scenario. In modeling you have kind of a high cost scenario, a middle scenario, and then a very optimistic scenario. This is the middle ground scenario. What's interesting here is this is a system of capturing CO2 from multiple industries and transporting it to multiple geologic storage settings, some involving oil and gas production, many others not. But it's 300 million tons of CO2 managed annually in what you see here, and this isn't the whole United States. For context, the U.S. emits about 5 gigatons of CO2 a year, 5 billion tons of CO2 a year to be managed. So we're talking about a significant portion of total U.S. emissions in this context. The other thing I'd point out is how there's this clustering where you have lower cost sources of CO2 and storage opportunities converging, like in the Gulf Coast of Texas and Louisiana, or in Kansas and Oklahoma, or in our region centered around Wyoming, but building out. These are the lower Midwest as well. These are what we're calling carbon hubs that can evolve to manage CO2 at large scale. This is just a map of the pipeline part of this and what the pipeline pipelines would cost. Clearly, there is a big advantage in scale. The bigger the pipelines, the more efficient they are at transporting CO2, so you have to get to big systems for this to become the most cost-effective. It's just like transmission. We all know that from wind energy development. If we're below 245 kV, the transmission costs a lot more. The higher we get, the more efficient and the less the transmission costs for any given wind farm. That's the same for carbon capture and storage. This is the high cost sensitivity. So assuming that, capture costs more, transport costs more, things aren't what we expect, you still see here a significant, one second here, I needed to be able to see my slide better. I had a box open. It's much less deployment of infrastructure, but it's still not insignificant. For example, the ethanol industry, most of the ethanol industry starts doing carbon management. My personal view is it's just a hunch that under 45Q, the U.S. ethanol industry will be the first industry in the world to capture more than half its CO2 emissions through carbon capture and storage. And then finally, this is the optimistic scenario. This is over half a gigaton of CO2, 670 million tons, and you can start to see how significant the system. You see a lot more saline storage in this. That's the big distinction between the first one I showed you and this one, is that saline storage, you can't sell the CO2, you just have the tax credit. And so you need a lot of things to come together to have a lot of saline storage, because you can't sell the CO2 to an oil company. You don't have the same market. So I'm just about done here. This is maybe a point that will hopefully resonate for all of us as North Dakotans, and I'm sure there's some Minnesotans on the call as well. We have to come up with climate solutions that speak to the politics and economy of large sections of the country, one of which we're living in. And what this whole exercise, this modeling that I showed you in bringing state officials and companies and environmental groups and labor unions together on a regional basis, is it's helping policymakers and their constituents start to think about truly large-scale carbon management. And we're calling them carbon hubs. I pointed them out to you on one of the maps. What's exciting about this is it's shifting the whole climate conversation to one of opportunity, getting states and stakeholders aligned around planning for policy and projects and CO2 infrastructure, and thinking about how our region of the country could become a global leader in carbon management. That doesn't take away from anything else that we need to be doing, which is continuing to scale up wind and solar and efficiency. We have to push those things as hard as we've pushed them in the past. But this opens up a whole new realm of effort, both to meet climate goals, but also to provide some reassurance to the many thousands of people who are in very high-wage jobs in existing industries and are very concerned about the loss of those jobs, and also to the communities that are supported by those jobs and by tax base from those industries. And then just very quickly here, we're working with taking this modeling and working with individual states to develop policies that will make each state carbon capture ready to take advantage of the 45Q tax credit. North Dakota is one of a handful of states that has done more relative than others, but there's a lot more that we could do, especially on the incentive side. But at least in terms of the regulatory framework, North Dakota is one of the national leaders. There's some states, and I'm not picking on Missouri, but just as an example, Missouri has hardly even gotten started. So we're trying to meet states where they're at and work with legislators and governor staff and others, and to try to move the conversation as quickly as we can. And the urgency here is the 45Q tax credit has been authorized by Congress until the end of 2023. So just like with the wind production tax credit, the project has to begin construction within the authorization of the tax credit to qualify. A project that starts after that date won't qualify for the tax credit. So we have a very narrow window of opportunity for projects to move forward. We're of course trying to extend the 45Q tax credit as well so that it's available longer. We're providing information and fact sheets to states and to folks like all of us on the call who are interested in getting involved. We will very soon have fact sheets for all the states in the study region, North Dakota included, and will show graphically where the CO2 comes from by industry. It will also show which of the major facilities are targets for deployment of carbon capture, how much CO2 and at what cost. Here you see, again, how we're presenting. It's amazing how, we are so focused on power plants and cars. Most of us have no idea where the rest of the CO2 actually comes from. So this is kind of a learning exercise for everybody, myself included, over time. And then we're putting all of this on a website. I encourage all of you to take a look at the website with the understanding that it's a work in progress. As we finalize the analysis and the graphics and the different information for states, we're compiling state policies state by state so that we have a full database. We're putting it all up on this website so that everything's in one place. And then the final thing, last slide, and this is forthcoming, in the process of working with states in the way that I've just described over the last few years, the most common question we get, and Ed, this won't surprise you as a former legislator, people say, well, what are the jobs impacts? I mean, if we do all this, how many jobs is it going to create? And I realize, that for those of us on this webinar, climate is maybe our first priority, but politically we need to answer the jobs question. And believe it or not, in spite of all the work that's been done, myself and our organization included over many years, we do not have any kind of credible job study of what various levels of carbon capture deployment what the implications would be for jobs and investment. So we've partnered with the Rhodium Group to do a major study on what if we were to deploy carbon capture at the levels needed to meet the 2 and the 1.5 degree goals, what would the jobs be industry by industry that result? And in later phases, we actually want to have those results available at the state level so we can say, for example, take it to the North Dakota legislature. So I realize that was a bit long-winded, and it went longer than I thought I would. Craig, I told you I'd be shorter than this. I apologize for that. But I also know that you are, as people are especially interested in these things, so I wasn't quite as worried about taking the time. And I would love to answer any questions that you all have, concerns. I didn't talk about the project in North Dakota, the Tundra project. I'm happy to share my thoughts on it. I decided, Craig, I didn't want to present someone else's slides. I have slides from the companies involved. It just felt to me like that's, if you want to invite them at some point to give a presentation, I actually know they have hired, by the way, the person who developed the Petronova project in Texas, which is the most important carbon capture project at a power plant in the world. He's probably the most successful project developer in carbon capture. I'm sure he'd be happy to give a presentation at some point.
Okay.
So I'll shut up.
I know we've got some questions about what actually takes place as far as getting the CO2 to actually dissolve when it's pumped underground and remain as either a solid or soluble when it's down there.
Okay. So with the understanding that I have 2 degrees in history in international relations, and I am not a geologist, I have spent nearly 20 years working with geologists, so I'll do my best to give a layperson overview. First of all, when you capture CO2, it has to be compressed, and it's compressed into what's called a dense phase. Someone like me would call it a liquid. It is not technically a liquid, but for a normal person would think of it as a liquid. And the reason it's compressed into liquid form is the volumes shrink dramatically when you compress CO2 into a dense phase. Also, in order to inject it thousands of feet down at pressure, you need it in the dense phase. So one important thing to remember, and I'm actually going to show you some pictures while I talk here. I have a very close colleague at the Clean Air Task Force, Bruce Hill. He's a PhD geologist and probably in the national environmental and climate community the leading geologist working for an environmental group in the country. Certainly not in the field more broadly, but at least in the environmental advocacy world. And he has just some pictures of, so if you, I mentioned the fact that you compress the CO2, it's injected thousands and thousands of feet below ground. And here we have an example with the Grand Canyon. You get a sense of the strata we're talking about. The formations, if it's a saline formation, you're talking typically a sandstone formation. It's highly permeable, and it can take large volumes of CO2 because it's very porous, and that's just an example of sandstone that's exposed. But then there's in any formation, saline formation that you would inject CO2 into, there needs to be cap rock seals, and those would typically be shales, which are highly impermeable. So in most saline formations, if they're well studied, you're really not talking about leaks through the cap rock. You're talking about making sure that you have wellbore integrity where you've injected the CO2. EPA has a Class 6 well program for permitting saline injection. It's very rigorous. I would argue it's actually too rigorous. It makes it too hard to develop projects, and it's easier to permit hazardous waste in the United States than it is to permit the storage of CO2 geologically. And if we want it to be a climate solution, we have to figure out how to make that regulatory process easier. But the bottom line is that it's a very rigorous process to get a permit, and a lot of focus around maintaining the wellbore integrity. Now, what I would say is that CO2 stored geologically, whether it's a saline formation or an oil and gas formation, is not the same as storing natural gas underground. It's much deeper. If you think of Aliso Canyon that happened in California and all the problems with the leaking of the natural gas that was stored by the utilities there, the physical properties are vastly different. The CO2 is at great pressure. The physics of the CO2 leaking is actually very, very challenging. It is impossible for CO2 at depth to leak at a large scale. And there's intensive monitoring of the process. So really the challenge here for CO2 storage is not one, can we store it, can we do it safely? It's monitoring for what losses there are, which are in the 1% to 2% range from the injection process, because we have companies that will be claiming a tax credit based on the tons of CO2 stored, and it's really important that the tax credit they're claiming reflects the CO2 that they're actually storing. And that's where the real, and when I say uncertainty, I don't mean it's a problem. We can manage for it, but that's where the scrutiny needs to be. The geologic storage part of it is frankly the easiest part of it. It's the monitoring, reporting, and verification of the process of CO2 transport, compression, and injection is where the losses occur. They're very small, but they still need to be measured and accounted for because the federal government's offering a tax credit. I didn't talk at all about oil formations, but of course that's even less challenging because in an oil and gas formation you're talking about a reservoir that has trapped hydrocarbons at pressure for millions of years, and there you see a diagram of an oil trap. And so again, the areas where leakage can occur is where human beings have penetrated the cap rock. And that's where the management needs to be and is from a regulatory standpoint. And then here you just see a slide, just the scale of Bruce has put together some of the numbers from from DOE and compared them to our emissions, the volumes of storage. Then finally, the question that you asked, Craig, what happens to the CO2 once it's in the reservoir? Depends on the formation, but in some formations, the CO2 actually starts to mineralize over time, and it becomes fully diffused in the formation. So if you think about risk factors, if you're storing hazardous waste or nuclear waste or things like that, risk increases over time. The longer something is stored, the greater the risk there is, because human management over time becomes less and less certain. In the case of geologic storage of CO2, the risk is exactly the opposite. To the extent that there's risk in it, the very low, it's at the time of injection. Once the site is shut, the risk goes down over time to the point of being, from a modeling standpoint, scarcely measurable. So that's my kind of overview of the storage piece.
All right.
Brad, a question for you.
Yep.
I separate CO2 into CO2 from all those other industrial sources that you mentioned, which, well, you educated me on that. I didn't realize there were that many other sources. And the ones you get from burning fuels for energy. And for energy resources, compressing CO2 and injecting it underground to get rid of it is a net energy loser. So why would any power company want to engage in this activity?
Well, what you said is not technically true. It's not a net energy loser.
You're right. It's
not
really
if you mean
close.
seriously the word net. Huh?
It's really close, though. Different people.
No, it's not, Dexter. That's wrong. It's just not.
Really?
There's an economic penalty that's serious. It's in the neighborhood. It's at the upper end. It's a 30% economic penalty in power generation. But with today's technologies, we're going to be able to get that down to 20%. Okay. This is not about CO2 emissions. This is just the energy penalty you're talking about, which is the energy required to capture the CO2, to compress it, to transport it. All the management in the whole process definitely is an issue. And with next generation technologies that are starting to be demonstrated, there's an expectation that we can get that penalty down to 10 or 15%. It's possible with net power, which is being demonstrated now at 50 megawatt scale in Texas, that we can get the cost of capture and the energy penalty down so low that a new natural gas plant with that turbine will be nearly cost competitive or cost competitive with today's combined cycle natural gas power plant. So for me, it's first and foremost a climate question. As long as we are capturing over 90% of the CO2 from the flue gas, if we have to use extra energy to run the carbon capture equipment, which we do, that's not a net climate burden. Now, it is an economic penalty, and a power company needs to be able to make money in the power market. But one of the challenges we have, and this is what the 45Q tax credit starts to change, but it doesn't go far enough, is that our current renewable energy policies are not based on emissions. They're based on every kilowatt hour of renewably generated electricity that we put onto the grid. Doesn't really matter whether CO2 emissions are reduced in the process. The power company gets or the generator gets the tax credit. So, for example, if there's a wind farm in Washington State that is displacing hydro on the grid, it may result in almost no emissions reductions, but it still gets the wind production tax credit. So we have a public policy problem in that we're not incentivizing emissions reductions. And if we did that, the cost situation would look different, because capturing CO2 from a power plant, whether you like a fossil fuel power plant or not, I understand that there are folks on this call that would rather not see fossil fuel power generation, but setting that aside for a moment, if you capture 90% of the CO2 off of our plant that is dispatching, free at a high capacity factor in the power market, you're talking about an enormous amount of generation that you're effectively decarbonizing. And it takes an awful lot of wind and solar at the capacity factors, even the capacity factor for wind in North Dakota, an awful lot of wind to get the same carbon benefit. Again, in no instance am I making an argument against, I am an advocate of all these things, but we really need to look differently at our metrics if we're looking at it from a climate standpoint.
I think there's some roughly 90 major coal burning power plants in the United States. How many of those are doing significant work with carbon capture at the present time?
Significant work, I would say, is under a dozen. So what you will see in the realm, I think, and this is speculation on my part, nobody really knows yet. There is a portion of the fleet, I don't want to give you a percentage, maybe it's a quarter of the fleet, maybe it's a little less, 20%, where these power plants were built very recently. They're highly efficient. They have made all the investments that you need to manage the pollutants other than CO2. An example, we have an example here in North Dakota, and it's Spiritwood. Spiritwood was built within the last 10 years, super efficient, very low emitting of the criteria pollutants. There's a number of plants like that around the country. It would be very hard to shut those down in the sense that, even if that's what you want to do, because they're a long ways from being paid for, it would be much better cost effectively to retrofit them with carbon capture, and that would be cost effective from a carbon standpoint. I don't think we will foresee a situation where we would be retrofitting a significant percentage of the existing coal fleet. There are some older plants which are located in optimal places where you might want to make the investment in carbon capture equipment, but only if those power plants have already had their investments for things like controlling SOx and NOx. So, we have some older power plants in western North Dakota that it might be cost effective to retrofit them with carbon capture, even though they're not that new, but it's as much because the cost of the coal is very low and they're dispatching a lot, so they run a lot, and they're located more or less right over storage and won't require big pipeline investments. So I think that might be the exception, would be plants like that, but otherwise we're talking about the most efficient, newest plants in the fleet that would be candidates.
Brad, this is Ed. Say, I've been on Zoom, never been on Zoom before, but can you read the chat messages that are coming across?
I have to switch gears a little bit. On my end, I think I can go to them. What is odd? Craig, You know how that bar comes up when you move your cursor, Craig, for you?
If you bring the cursor down towards the bottom of your screen, I think it should pop up a little bar for you.
That's what usually happens for me. It's not happening now, and so I am not finding the chat box. I apologize for that. I wonder since I've showed the presentation, maybe I could.
If you stop sharing your screen, you might be able to.
There, that's what I'll do. I'll stop sharing. Okay, now I can see it.
Okay, there we go.
Okay. So starting at the top, are these costs per ton of CO2 or ton of carbon? It's ton of CO2.
Okay, we kind of asked the next one about.
Kind of did the storage part.
Yep.
Just scrolling down here.
Paul had a question there about the direct air capture.
About direct air capture, I can go back up and check the other ones. So
yeah,
this one must be up.
648 is the timestamp on that one.
648, thank you.
Yeah.
Okay, now I'm there. Okay, good question. So carbon engineering, work closely with them. They are one of the 3 major technology companies working to commercialize direct air capture technology. They have a 1 million ton project under development that will be built in Texas with Occidental, be the first of its kind at 1 million ton scale. Right now they say, this is off the top of my head, okay, but their cost per ton is above 150 and below $200 a ton. That's that's their estimate. I don't remember exactly the number. That sounds like a lot, but that is cheaper on a per ton basis than solar photovoltaic. If you look at what it actually costs for large-scale solar PV, you're talking about costs north of $150 a ton, up to $300 a ton or more. If you add in storage, it can get even higher than that. So even though direct air capture is very costly, it is not the most expensive option, and like I said, in this spectrum of things that we need to be doing. Now, if you're talking about something like utility scale solar, then that's cheaper, of course. So now the other part of the question is, scale. Well, that comes down to a policy framework. If in the next 10 years we can deploy multiple 1 million ton scale direct air capture projects, and the technology is working well, and the costs are coming down, which has been our experience for every type of technology in the energy sector we've ever deployed, from wind to solar to hydraulic fracturing to scrubbers on power plants. The experience every single time is that costs come down dramatically because we learn how to operate the technology. We learn how to manufacture it more efficiently. We learn how to do, you think about wind farm construction today compared to 15 years ago, the dramatic changes. Also, even financing projects. I remember working with Mike Eagle at Basin Electric in the early part of the previous decade when they built the first wind farm north of my ranch, how complicated it was to think through the financing and everything that they did. And now it's just commoditized. I mean, they just crank these things out. And this can be done with carbon capture as well, and direct air capture. So is it very, very challenging to bring direct air capture to climate scale? Absolutely. But it's challenging politically and policy-wise. I don't know that it's challenging from a technology or a geologic storage standpoint. We've got way, way more geologic storage than we need to store that much CO2 for centuries to come, as I already pointed out. Can we, in our very conflicted ideological political process today, can we muster the will and the focus to put in place the kind of policies that would lead to that level of deployment? That, to me, is the open question. And kind of, to be honest, the scary part about the future is that our politics is so divisive right now that we're not able to get past our differences and mobilize around the kinds of incentives that we need to do this.
Thank you for that response.
I'm looking at some of the observations about CO2 storage and being soluble in water. It's highly soluble in water at pressure when it as a dense phase. It just is. So that's just not, unfortunately, it's just not correct. And we have decades of experience at millions of tons of scale to prove that. And as far as there, I was scanning through, I saw a question about volumes. The volumes we're talking about, like in a saline formation of CO2 occupying those volumes, again in a dense phase form, are a very small percentage of the total aquifer's volume. It's not like we're taking a balloon and pumping it up. we're not pressurizing the reservoir significantly here. The CO2 disperses throughout the and starts to mineralize with the rock, and those volumes are monitored and are regulated. So I'm just kind of scrolling through here on some of the questions.
At 7 p.m. there was one about forest management and BECC, BECC.
Okay. Sure. That's a great question. I have a colleague, his name is Brendan Jordan, who can speak at great length about this, including in Minnesota. He's Twin Cities based. But let me speak generally on the topic. So BECC stands for bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And so if you think about what happens with photosynthesis, a plant takes atmospheric CO2 up through uptake into the plant, and then it's converted into carbon, and oxygen is emitted, right? That's, we all learned that in science in middle school, if not elementary school. Now, in normal bioenergy, whether it's ethanol, making ethanol and burning it as fuel in a car, or, heating a building or a home with wood, or, other types of biomass utilization for energy production, in a combustion setting, usually that CO2 that is photosynthetic carbon that's locked up in the plant material that's burned, that CO2 is returned to the atmosphere. If you put carbon capture on an energy system that has biomass as a feedstock, you are not returning that original photosynthetic carbon to the atmosphere. So if a project is designed properly, emphasis on properly, and the procurement of the biomass feedstock is sustainable, then you can have net negative carbon emissions from a bioenergy facility that has carbon capture, along assuming that you're storing that CO2 geologically. Does that all make sense to everybody? Because you'll hear people talk about BECCS, but it's rarely explained. In Minnesota, there's obviously lots of opportunities for managing forests sustainably for wood production. There's also opportunities for managing forests for forest health, where you can take, a certain amount of woody biomass out of the forest. And there's a debate about how much is sustainable, but we all know that certain levels are sustainable, and that's also true of agricultural production of biomass. For example, conservation-based harvest of grasslands, where you're, leaving stands of grass every, say potentially every other year, and harvesting the rest and using that for biomass. Those are examples of sustainable biomass, where if you then capture the CO2 on the energy production side, you can get negative emissions. In ethanol production, it's in the form of the CO2 that is emitted off of fermentation. Normally that's vented directly, or the CO2 is used in some food grade application like dry ice or carbonated beverages, but it's ultimately, again, re-emitted to the atmosphere. But there are 2 ethanol plants in Kansas, and the one I mentioned, a very large one in Illinois, that are now capturing their CO2 from fermentation, and they are storing that CO2 geologically. So they are actually, depending on, in some cases, getting close to not necessarily negative emissions. You'd have to also do things that I know you're all interested in, for example, managing agronomic practices to manage for soil carbon and things like that. If you start doing all those things together with the production for the ethanol and the capture of the CO2 from the ethanol, you can actually get to a negative carbon ethanol. But you have to do all of those things across the whole value chain. So these things are all context specific. What's sustainable in one place is not sustainable in another. Tropical forests are different from temperate forests. Temperate grasslands are different from other types of ecosystems. And soils differ from place to place. So what would what you need to do BECCS, where you're procuring the biomass sustainably and then managing the carbon on the back end so it's not re-emitted as CO2 into the atmosphere, those are project-specific things. There's no sort of template project that would work in every place. I don't know. I hope that's helps.
You know, I think you hit on something really key a few minutes ago. I think we sort of all know that in terms of technology and engineering, we could do these things, but there are costs involved. And I want you to cheer me up, Brad. Make me happy here. How are we going to incentivize these industries to do what's right? Are we going to throw money at them? Because that's a political issue, right? I mean, how do we incentivize these industries? Tell me how we're going to do it in your wildest dreams.
Well, so let me go back online for a moment. Or I'm online. I meant to say share my slide deck here. I'm going to show you, Dexter, a slide here. I included some extra slides because I didn't know what the questions would be. So, so I already showed you this slide before, right? And I included it again just to remind you, these are kind of the, based on purity of CO2, kind of the 4 levels of cost from the various industries of capturing CO2. Now I'm showing you, and I had to make my, okay. This is a paper that came out in 2018. And let me start off by saying, I think in the spirit of intellectual honesty here, these are not entirely subjective exercises, but any cost estimate of a carbon mitigation option is highly dependent on the assumptions you choose for your analysis. So these 2 gentlemen chose to provide ranges based on different studies that use different assumptions. And what you see here in this table 2 from this paper are a number of things that we need to be doing to meet what are very, very ambitious climate goals. What's interesting about this is the costs on a per ton basis vary dramatically. Some things, as we know, are even negative, you know, and certain types of energy efficiency, you save money by doing it, full stop. But what's really interesting are some things, because we don't base our incentives on emissions reductions, but on technologies. I mentioned the example of the wind PTC, the solar ITC is the same thing. Look at the range on renewable portfolio standards. Very affordable to almost zero, all the way to very expensive. If you recall, power plants are $55 to $75 a ton. So in the case of renewable electricity in the context of a portfolio standard, because it's based on the technology and not on the emissions, we're paying anything from very, very low cost to very, very high cost to reduce a ton of carbon. I call your attention to solar photovoltaics. This really shocks people. I mean, I love solar energy. My wife and I still plan to do rooftop solar. So again, I want to be real clear here. I'm not making an argument against solar, but we do not appreciate that in terms of carbon mitigation, these are not the most cost-effective strategies. It doesn't mean we shouldn't do them. To get to the 2 and 1.5 degree scenarios, I would argue we need to deploy all these things. What I would say to maybe make you feel better, Dexter, is that if we I wanted to bring back so I could see you all again. I had to close my windows to see my own slide. If we start to shift our thinking to the metric of what does it cost society to reduce a ton of CO2, again, not in the interest of promoting one thing or another, but just to be clear about what our investments are, the kinds of expenditures we're already making, through the federal tax credits for renewables, incentives for efficiency. Now we have one for carbon capture. We can tailor those more for carbon reductions. So for example, we should be developing a lot more wind farms in North Dakota from a cost of carbon standpoint than we should in Washington State, because Washington State has huge amounts of hydropower, which is dirt cheap, and there's no reason to displace hydropower on the grid. We should be doing a lot more solar outside of California. There's so much solar in California right now that the system can't absorb it all, and they push it to neighboring states for free just to manage the generation. The costs of that on a per ton basis are extraordinarily high. The costs in terms of electricity, not so much. But again, if climate is our metric, so and it's very hard to make this argument because our fellow environmental and climate advocates get defensive and feel like it's an argument against renewables and the successes we've had to date. It really isn't. It's just saying, look, our climate goals are so enormous. We need to be really intentional about what we're spending our money on and make sure that our incentives for these things are focusing on those projects that maximize the carbon reductions. And that's true across all technologies.
I can tell you from my experience, being one of just a few houses with photovoltaic panels on the roof, it's probably not worth it. You just don't save that much money because electricity is so cheap.
Right.
But in
And
terms of
you're talking to a guy, you may remember this, Dexter. In 2001, we spent $15,000 for a 1 kilowatt wind turbine and 200 watts of solar panels, and we were off the grid for 3 years.
Yeah.
And it would cost us $15,000. We never paid that back. I'm happy to do things that don't pencil out, but I actually think that there's two things. One, we need to have our incentives be targeted towards the emissions reductions. But the other piece of this is that we need to be, as climate advocates, and I think I'm on everybody on this webinar, I'm speaking are of that perspective, we need to be more open and expansive about the things we're willing to advocate for. Because if you're a blue-collar worker at a refinery in Louisiana, the Gulf Coast of Louisiana, you don't have a good option other than that job. Your other good option might be to work at an LNG export terminal in Louisiana, but it's not in installing solar or building wind farms, and the wages aren't nearly as high, or operating wind farms, I meant to say. So we need to, in addition to promoting the things that we've traditionally worked on, which we have to continue to do, we need to have a broader agenda that includes keeping people employed in the industries they work in at very high wage jobs. I remember we organized a major national conference on carbon capture in 2018, and we invited the executive secretary of the Montana AFL-CIO to speak. And he literally brought tears to my eyes because he talked about driving from, I think it was Billings to Colstrip, the major coal-fired power plant in rural Montana, and then from Colstrip on to Glendive, I think it was. And he talked about driving through miles and miles of nothing, and then suddenly as you get to Colstrip, you've got, middle-class homes and livelihoods and, thriving communities, and then again you have miles and miles of nothing. And I don't say nothing in the sense of derogatory, because I live in those miles and miles of nothing and I love it. But there aren't high-wage jobs where I live, other than if you're a doctor or a physician or have a professional job in town. If you're out in the rural country here, you don't have high-wage employment. Even at the wind farm, it's not high-wage compared to these coal plants or the oil field or this or that. So we need to have, and I'm going a little on here, I apologize, but we need to have as part of our advocacy agenda and the policies we're advocating for a set of policies that will help these existing industries decarbonize. We can't let them off the hook. We've got to reduce emissions. But if solving the climate problem means that we need to shut down all of these industries in places like North Dakota and Louisiana, politically we will lose. We just will. So I'm not sure that I'm inspiring you, Dexter, but I'm trying to offer I think a way forward that brings allies rather than pushes people away. Does that make sense?
It makes sense, and what you say in part is why I've sort of split with some of the traditional environmental groups on this matter. But I'm a little bit less sympathetic towards traditional power industries than you seem to be, Brad.
Well, I understand, and I don't think, again, I'm not. I already said this, but I don't think anybody is seriously advocating for repowering the entire coal plant fleet with carbon capture. Even folks in that industry that are supportive of this technology, they're talking about doing this on a subset of the plants.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep.
Okay, let's see.
I should go back to I'll stop sharing, go back to the chat in case.
And
Okay,
Yeah,
Brad.
when I'm done here, by the way, I'll just create a PDF and send it to Craig, and Craig, you can share it with your distribution. And some of these extra
Nice.
slides, I'll have those still tacked on at the end.
okay.
Brad, this is Ed. I've got a question for you. Now,
Sure.
you're familiar with the Citizens Climate Lobby and their push
I am.
to climate, a fee on carbon or a tax on carbon. It's a disincentive. Well, it's a reverse incentive for industry to clean up their own mess. How would this play into, would a carbon fee play into this carbon capture?
It depends, Ed, on how it's designed. So the first incentive to actually lead to large-scale commercial carbon capture in the world actually happened in Norway in I believe it was 96, but that's off the top of my head. Norway imposed a $55 per ton carbon tax on their offshore oil and gas industry. But it was $55 right off the top, and this was over a quarter century ago. And that was enough of an incentive for then Statoil, now Equinor, to go on their offshore oil and gas rigs to start separating CO2 out of the natural gas. There's a certain amount of CO2 in any gas field, and it varies depending on the gas field. And around the world, most natural gas companies vent the CO2 that they strip out of the natural gas that they produce. And so the Norwegian Parliament implemented the carbon tax as an incentive to basically encourage/force the oil industry to not vent that CO2 that was stripped from natural gas and instead capture it and re-inject it. And in this case, they re-injected it from the same platforms, but in a different formation under the North Sea, a saline formation rather than the gas field. The problem with the challenge I see with carbon pricing or carbon tax is that most of the proposals are not at a level per ton, that don't start off at a level per ton that would justify carbon capture except at these lower tier of industrial facilities. So ethanol, again, gas processing, fertilizer production. The other risk is that the political calculus that's being made is that we should give the money back to, say the public as a dividend. I understand the politics of that. The challenge is that you are not creating incentive that justifies deployment of carbon capture, and then you are sending the money to citizens, and it isn't provided to the companies to then invest in the technology. And so I think unless the carbon price program, tax or otherwise, is designed properly, you incentivize low carbon technologies that are already widespread in the marketplace, so wind, solar, and efficiency, and that's a good thing. But you won't get the new technologies being pushed into the marketplace like carbon capture, deep geothermal, different types of renewable systems that are dispatchable, you know, and aren't variable. So those kinds of technologies that we know we need to get to zero by mid-century, we still will need additional policies. Again, I'm not making it, my point here is not to make an argument against a carbon tax, simply to say that unless it's a carbon tax like Norway did, and I think that'd be politically really difficult in the United States to have a carbon tax that ambitious, we would still need some of these tax credits and other policies targeting specific technologies. Advanced nuclear is another one. They're moving to commercial demonstration of small-scale advanced nuclear reactors that are very promising. But the costs, at least for the first projects, are going to be beyond what a carbon tax would pay for. Now, there are some proposals, especially on the Republican side, for a carbon tax that would take some of that revenue and directly invest it in incentives for some of these technologies. Kind of pairs both ideas together in a carbon tax.
They're letting you off the hook, Brad.
Who's letting me off the hook?
Let's see. There was another question here about, at the beginning you had mentioned a non-carbon sequestration answer for controlling climate change, and that has never been done in human history. He was curious as to what you might be referring to.
Oh, so what I didn't mean that they were solutions. If I said that, I misspoke and apologize. Not
Okay.
Solutions that had never been done, but at a pace and scale of deployment that we've never seen before. So forcing wind and solar and efficiency into the system, not taking issue with the ultimate scale, but so fast and so much, even levels faster than China, for example, broke records in the pace and scale of their wind and solar deployment, as we all know. But what was required was forced into the IPCC modeling were levels of deployment at a pace that we've never seen before. And my point is not that under some theoretical scenario that could not be done. I think it potentially could. But I think climate scientists and most of us on this webinar see climate change as the greatest threat that we face. And we shouldn't be making bets on what will work and what won't work. And so we should be, in my view, and I think this is increasingly the view in the scientific community, is that we should be taking responsible steps to deploy all of these options now to make sure that we get to the goals we need to get at, because each time you take one of the options off the table, it's both a function of math but of politics. Each time we take an option off the table, like for example, after Fukushima, the German government basically made a commitment to take existing nuclear offline. And the result of that is that Germany has failed to meet its own climate goals and has had to increase coal-fired power generation. For those of you who have ever know Germany or have been to Germany, you understand how profound the environmental ethic is in Germany, and that a country with that sense of environmental and climate commitment would be increasing coal-fired power generation is just insane. But they took one of the tools that's needed to get to zero completely out of the system. And that's the danger here, is that the modeling in the 1.5 degree scenario that didn't have carbon capture from power plants and industrial facilities, didn't have BECCS, didn't have direct air capture, it had to force all the other options to such extremes that, in my view, it's not a credible and responsible path for trying to meet our climate goals. It's too risky. That's what I meant to say. I should say that the IEA modeling of the 2 degree scenario was even starker, in the sense that the majority of what the IEA and the IPCC both do is they take a series of climate models and they run all of them. And that's how they try to have as robust a results as possible, so they don't just use one model. And of course, they're big institutions, they have the resources to do that. We don't at the Great Plains Institute. We use just, but in any case, they run all these models, and that's where they come up with their conclusions. And in the IEA case, all but 2 of their models could not even solve for the 2-degree scenario without carbon capture, which is pretty extraordinary.
Yeah. No, there was one other question of when it comes to the carbon sequestration, do you envision landowners would get compensated like they do by owning mineral rights as far as when it's pumped into those geological structures?
I do, and there was an aborted effort in, I believe it was Dunn County, maybe beyond Dunn County as well. There's a tremendous saline storage characteristics in Dunn County. And there was a company, I'm going to forget the name now, it was funded by very wealthy Americans concerned about climate. It was a kind of a startup company. C12 was the name of it, C like Charlie, C12. And they were actually working with landowners in Dunn County to contract with them to pay them to store CO2 in the pore space in the saline formation under their land. What's really important, though, is the first stop here is state legislators, in the sense that if state law, falls under state law, not federal, the regulation of pore space. And it's very clear in oil and gas, because we have a private mineral estate, and for better or for worse, it's private, as we all know from the whole experience in the Bakken and what was entailed in private mineral rights and landowner rights and everything else. So if you're storing the CO2 in an oil and gas formation, you are taking CO2, or you're taking oil out of that pore space, and you own those mineral rights as the oil producer, or you're working with the mineral rights owner through contract, and then you are putting CO2 in that same pore space. So the ownership is clear. And so if there's a payment for the storage of the CO2 in an oil and gas setting, it's either going to go to the mineral owner who is not the surface owner, or potentially the surface owner that has mineral rights. In most cases, the oil company is actually just producing more oil as a result of the CO2, and so the mineral owner benefits that way. So it's not really the CO2 storage, if that makes sense. When you shift to a saline formation, you're talking about pore space where no oil and gas is being produced. And until recently, state law was not clear on who owned that pore space because it had no economic value. North Dakota, and this is kind of where I come down, I think rightly, and Ed, I don't remember if you were in the legislature for that bill or not. I know Wayne Stenjum worked hard on it as Attorney General behind the scenes to establish that the surface owner owns the pore space. So that opens the door for landowners to benefit in carbon management in that way. There are other states, though, with geologic storage resources that haven't passed legislation to clarify that.
Is that really clear in North Dakota? The people at the EERC tell me it's not really cleared up yet.
Well, I think they are referring to enhanced oil recovery, where you're storing the CO2 through enhanced oil recovery and oil and gas formation. They work very closely with a company called Denbury. Denbury is the one that's built the pipeline from Wyoming to Cedar Creek Anticline in Montana, and we're talking about them extending that pipeline on into North Dakota, right? You're probably familiar specifically with the project, but it's been even in news coverage in North Dakota. They have how can I put this diplomatically? They have legal theories about their mineral leases with mineral owners that is not fully accepted in the legal community, but at least is plausible. And they say that their particular leases, once they start storing CO2, they have changed the economic purpose of their activity, and then they have issues with access to their oil fields where they don't own the mineral rights. I think that's probably what ERC was talking about. That is, but in a saline, I've never heard folks at ERC raise doubts about North Dakota law with respect to saline storage. They're working very closely, for example, with Red Trail at Richardson, the ethanol plant, to do saline storage. And I think if they felt they had a legal problem, they wouldn't be as far down that path as they are. But I'm sort of speculating here, Dexter.